Let me start with a comment. My comment, I will say this, at the risk of offending many people in the room, what really struck me for the past a day and a half is that this is supposed to be a dialogue of civilizations, but so far it strikes me as a wholesale criticism of one civilization, which sometimes explicitly mentioned, but many other times it's not explicitly mentioned. Okay, that's my first comment. Now, what I will present here is called the paradigms of world order, beyond the one, the two, and the many. So for those of you who are familiar with the works of the late Samuel Huntington, he wrote a book called, called Paradigms of American Politics, Beyond the One and the Two and the Many. So here I have to acknowledge my intellectual debt to Samuel Huntington. So what did I mean by this beyond the one and the two and the many? So one is this conventional perspective on international relations. That is, this is a unipolar world, especially after 1991, the breakup of the former Soviet Union, and the United States is viewed as the only superpower. And then what is about the two? Two, that means there's a competition between superpowers. So that is sometimes called the G2. Today, people say China, America. Sometimes they coin the term Chimerica. And then, so during the Cold War, it's the USSR and the US. That is the two. And now, with the rapid rise of China, many people are seeing a kind of a bipolar world featuring US-China competition or possibly confrontation. And then what is a many? Many means there's a multipolar world that is emerging. And a multipolar world, that means there are multiple centers of power spread across the world. There's no, like, the center of power in Washington, D.C. or Brussels. So what I would like to argue is that my point is not really revolutionary. I'm not saying something like the groundbreaking, but what I'm saying or suggesting is that we can look at the international world order today from a slightly different perspective. That is, I argue that none of these three perspectives can do justice to the current world order. Instead, the one that we're seeing today is probably, we can use the word from American politics, that's called pluralism. Nobody really absolutely dominates. And your dominance depends on the specific issue area that we are talking about. So for example, this is a point that has been alluded by a number of speakers. That is, on security and defense, the United States remains the world's only superpower. So on that dimension, you do see the one. But then if you are talking about the distribution of economic power, and the US, China, EU, Japan, and the other members of the BRICS countries, they constitute the multipolar world. And then finally, if you believe in this concept of soft power, I know many people don't believe in this concept of soft power, and then the picture appears to be even more diverse and more heterogeneous. And we're really seeing, and I would argue, a truly multipolar world. So my following presentation is just a quick run through of some of this data that many of you should probably be familiar with. So one example, this is from the World Bank. You look at the GDP share of these major countries. You look at the US, you look at China and Russia. They are projected on here, and you can see there's a very clear and significant decline of US share of the world GDP. And then there's a very, very conspicuous increase of China and then the other countries. And then this is the share of world GDP in 2013, again from the World Bank. You look at what is really striking about this slide, look at the pie chart, is that the other part constitutes more than 50% of the world GDP. So this is a big, big contrast with what the situation was like right after the Second World War, during the height of the American power. So today you look at the United States, it's a slightly bigger share of China, but then you have Brazil, you have Russia, and then you have India. And then if we factor in many other countries like Indonesia and other South Africa, and then the pie will become even less favorably presented for the United States of America. And then this is a look at the US and the BRICS countries' aggregate trade exports. Again, see here, well, what is really striking, and which is not surprising at all, is that there's a big, big spike, not spike, a drop, in 2008 because of the financial crisis. And then you look at these trends, very clear, very unmistakable. That is, U.S. economy is declining in its importance, not in absolute terms, but in relative terms. And then this is U.S. and BRICS countries' imports, again from the world, and this is from WTO data. And here, many people talk about this U.S.-China confrontation or competition, the coming conflicts with China. Now, what is the reality? So look at here, this is the USA and China military expenditure. And now we're really comparing pears and apples. And so for those who are hyping about this China threat, and there's really little empirical ground. I think there's a lot of ground for perception and misperception. But again, I have to make it clear, I'm not here to defend about the rise of China or to debunking this myth of the China threat. But these are the data, and if you believe in the sources of the data. And this is NATO members spending on the military, plus we compare this with the Shanghai Cooperation Organization's military spending. And you look at the two lines. They are far, far apart from each other. And this is a very simple point. NATO countries spend much, much more militarily than does the membership of Shanghai Cooperation Organization. That includes China and Russia. Now let me fast forward, move to another concept, that is a soft power. Many people argue that China's soft power is rising, and China is overtaking the United States in terms of its attractiveness and appeal of its culture, the China model, etc. And here, I just got the data from the Pew Global Attitudes Indicator database, and look at this. Across many continents, the United States has a clear lead over China, except I think it's in the Middle East, where China has a 49% favorable. And then you look at Latin America, US leads, Europe. The data is pretty clear, so I won't go into details about the data. And then this is another way to look at soft power. This is a ranking constructed by a UK-based institute called IFG, Institute for Government. And this is a quite different index of the soft power. But you look at here the ranking. Number one is not the United States of America. It's the UK, probably surprising because this one is based in the UK. Maybe there's some bias in favor of the UK. And then you look at US and Germany, you look at Japan, and you look at where's China. China is ranked 22. Now, what are the components of this soft power index? You look at government, you look at culture, you look at diplomacy, you look at education, and then you look at business, innovation, etc. So these are the 5 core components of this soft power index. So for more details, you can check out how they actually weigh the data and come up with the compound index. Okay. And then here's another slide to show the real big gap between China's soft power and the US soft power. This is again from the Pew Research. This is a large sample across the world. And on the left hand is does the US is viewed as respecting freedom, and then is China being viewed as respecting freedom? So you can clearly see that there's a big gap between China and the United States in terms of soft power. But in terms of military hard power, the United States has an unmistakable and a clear advantage over China. Now, these are some of this basic data. I think most of you guys probably are not interested in, but here a couple of thoughts for discussion, or maybe for some takeaway points. Number one, what is driving this emerging world order? I think you can argue that one set of factors, what I would call the structural factors, the globalization, like the increasing free flow of capital, goods, and people across border. And so for those of you who read the current bestseller, Capital by Thomas Piketty, and then you realize that how devastating that the free flow of capital can bring havoc to economies, not just like Greece, but also can bring a lot of damage to Chinese economy and the US economy. And then some of these macro demographic trends, for example, Japan is getting really old. It's an aging problem. But India has one of the youngest population. And China is becoming old before China is becoming modern. And so China is facing the same demographic trends. And then technological innovations like Apple and others, So some of these, I call them, are structural factors. And then there are some other factors that I would say leadership decisions, What kind of rules you adopt, institutions? Like if you read the book called Why Nations Fail, it's an argument about domestic politics. It's not about some powerful countries are imposing their own system on your country. I think eventually and ultimately, what kind of system is adopted in the country is largely determined by your own country's people's choice, not by some superpower like the United States or China or Russia. And then leadership decisions, for example, US invasion of Iraq, I think this is a very good example of how bad policy decisions could bring disastrous consequences to a country's power. And then you can also give the opposite example of China's embrace of market reform. It's really uplifting China's, not just the average Chinese living standards, but it's also really improving China's prestige on the international stage. Now, what are the reactions to the world order that we are seeing today? I think the US, many of you alluded to this point, that the United States, against this emerging world order, the United States appears to be the most anxious, or for those who are liberal-leaning, you can say it's most reactionary. So, for example, pivot to Asia, you have TPP, you have TTIP, Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, and then what is happening in Ukraine. And if you believe in conspiracy theory, and then you can say all of this is a big conspiracy by the United States to maintain its own power dominance. And then look at China. What is China's reaction? China, I think, there is a very perceptible, very conspicuous kind of a celebratory mood. China is finally back on the stage, and in a big way. But then foreign perceptions of Chinese, it's about arrogance, for example, at Copenhagen, and then you look at Chinese assertiveness. Some of my colleagues already alluded to this point too, because of China's maritime disputes. And then what about Russia? Russia's reaction to this world order. Russia is getting tough with the United States, and the Russians are also beginning to cooperate with China on a number of issues like energy, like Ukraine and Syria. So final point. I think I'm doing okay with the time, right? So diversity without harmony. This is about a dialogue of civilizations. I think when we talk about dialogue, that means we are assuming that there's no superiority or inferiority of any civilization. We're on an equal footing. But what are the prospects of civilizational diversity with harmony in this emerging world? In Chinese, the Confucius once said, diversity in harmony, meaning we can live peacefully with each other, but at the same time, we can maintain our own cultural differences or political differences. Now, diversity, political, cultural, or ecological, is desirable. I think nobody really here questions the desirability of diversity. But what if diversity means authoritarian rule or personal dictatorship? Should we not rethink about diversity? Are we talking about diversity of dictatorship, or are we talking about a diversity of democracy? I think these are the things that we need to think about when we say, we are criticizing some civilization, but we are not really looking into our own civilization and ask this question. So in the end, my question is, what kind of diversity we want? And what kind of harmony? So I'll end here. Okay, thank you.